To raise his flag, justice, peace, protesting bad, on our voice, on our fight, on our deaths, on our rights. Hey, hey. Justice, peace, we made a joy. Justice, peace, to uncover the heart of a man, the way of this land. Justice for all was never the plan. Nah, it's never the plan. Justice peace for the two that part. Justice peace, let's talk smart. Justice peace for the two that part. Justice peace, let's talk smart.
All right. Good morning, everybody. This is the Justice Be Talk Show, Season 8, Episode 2. Today we have the lovely guest speaker, Professor Alexander Reinert, and we're going to be talking about qualified immunity. And today's interviewer is Shazia. So we can go ahead and get started.
Good morning, everyone. Today we have Professor Alexander Reinart. He's a law professor at Cardozo School of Law with extensive civil rights litigation experience. Before entering academia, he worked as a law associate specializing in the rights of incarcerated individuals, employment discrimination, and disability rights. He has litigated landmark civil rights cases and testified before Congress on qualified immunity. Since 2016, he has been the director of Cardozo's Center for Rights and Justice, overseeing programs promoting fairness, equality, and access to justice.
Good morning.
Good morning, Professor Reiner. I'm so excited to speak with you today.
I'm glad to be here with you. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you for coming on. So I just want to keep this conversational. I don't want to pressure you too much with too many questions.
Sounds good.
To start, can you share with us what initially drew you to areas of civil rights, litigation, and constitutional law?
Sure. So when I went to law school, I knew I wanted to do work in the public interest. I wasn't quite sure what kind of work I wanted to do, but that's the reason I went to law school. I went to law school to be an advocate. And when I was in my third year of law school, I did a clinic. In law school, you can work as a lawyer, even though you're still a student, as long as you're working under the supervision of another lawyer. And that's what law school clinics are. So I did a civil rights clinic in my third year of law school. And as part of that clinic, I worked with an incarcerated person who was bringing a case about the use of force when he was at Sing Sing Correctional Facility here in New York. And that really made me want to do more of the work. So when I graduated from law school, I clerked for a couple of years for some judges, and then and then I came back to New York to do more work with incarcerated people. That's sort of what set me on that path.
Okay, that sounds great. I hear you mentioned that you went to law school because you wanted to be an advocate. Did anything inspire you to want to be an advocate specifically?
Yeah, I mean, we could go very way back into my life as a kid and my grandparents, who both really, I think, instilled in me the idea that we need to be responsible for the world around us, and if we have a voice, we should try and raise that voice, especially when there are people who, for systemic reasons, have challenges raising their voice. I mean, and certainly incarcerated people fit into that into that rubric. So as a kid, I just always understood it was part of my responsibility to be an activist and be engaged in the world. When I went to law school, I was thinking about other things, but I had gone to a conference before law school. It was called rebellious lawyering. So it was basically, I didn't really know what a lawyer did. I didn't have lawyers in my family, and I had an idea of what a lawyer was, which sounded interesting, but didn't sound like being an activist. And then when I went to this conference, it was put on by a number of lawyers who really believed that to be an effective advocate and a lawyer required not just working in the courts, but also working in community with people outside of the courts. And I hadn't, that I didn't imagine that's what lawyers did. And so I think that opened my mind to what one could do as a lawyer. And I don't think I had that idea beforehand. So that's one of the things that convinced me that law school might be a good place for me. That's what I think propelled me in that direction.
That's great. Those so it's like those beliefs and values were instilled in you from a young age, and you found a way to live them in your career of choice. I love that.
Yeah, it's a privilege. It's really a privilege to be able to do that. And I think it could have been something else, but it just happened to be law that drew me in.
And your work has had significant impact on prison reform and the rights of incarcerated individuals. What are some of the most pressing legal challenges in this area today?
Well, it's not hard to find many. One of the things about working in this space is there are lots of barriers to advocating for people who are incarcerated, and partly it's because the law is really it's an uphill battle to just use the law on folks' behalf. And then, of course, I think we live in a world in which incarcerated people are not really seen unless we know people who are incarcerated or unless we ourselves have been incarcerated. I think for a lot of people in the United States, it's a space that they don't really even imagine, or what they imagine is not really close to what the reality is. So there's those challenges. I think the most pressing challenges these days are big picture, over incarceration, just the overuse of the criminal legal system, over punitiveness of the criminal legal system, too many people being in prison for too long. And then when people are in prison, there's serious medical care issues that come up. There's serious mental health issues that come up. There's, of course, brutality. I've done a lot of work, so that's a place where I think there's lots of challenges, but where we've made some progress. So I don't. I think there's lots of challenges. I think the biggest challenge is to help people who don't know people who are incarcerated to see them as human beings who deserve rights. I mean, to me, that's the biggest challenge.
I think so too. Because it is true. We don't know until we've known affected by the system. I agree. So today I brought you on to speak about specifically qualified immunity. What inspired this topic was me for me was during Donald Trump's 2024 campaign, he expressed strong support for law enforcement and proposed granting police officers immunity from prosecution. So I just wanted to learn more in that aspect, and I just wanted to know, could you explain what qualified immunity is in the simplest terms for people who don't know?
Yeah, absolutely. So imagine that there's someone who's had their rights violated by a police officer, and so they've been injured, or maybe in the worst case scenario, they've been killed, right? And so their family wants to seek some measure of justice. Um, and I think in the world, we think about justice both in terms of the criminal legal system, but we also think about it in terms of the civil legal system. So qualified immunity operates more in the civil system than in the criminal system, although there's some parallels. So what qualified immunity does is it says, well, if you bring a lawsuit against this officer, even if you can show that they violated the Constitution, they still might not be responsible. They still might not be held responsible by the legal system because of this doctrine of qualified immunity, which essentially allows them to argue that, well, I understand maybe I violated this person's rights, but it wasn't clear to me. It wasn't crystal clear to me from the law that I was violating this person's rights. And because it wasn't crystal clear, because it wasn't in the words of this doctrine clearly established that I was violating their rights, then you can't hold me accountable. That's essentially what qualified immunity does.
And I want you kind of just answered it in the questions, but how can someone, how does this affect the everyday individual? You kind of answered it, but just to make
Well,
it clear.
yeah, let's really make it as clear as possible. So, number one, a lot of lawyers might not take cases because they're worried about qualified immunity. So it might just be hard to find a lawyer for cases because lawyers know how hard it is to sue officers. Maybe it's police officers, maybe it's corrections officers, maybe it's some other public official. Qualified immunity applies to all public officials of all kinds. Then when you get to court, you have to overcome this law. You have to convince a judge that you should even go past the first stage of litigation, because the judge might say, well, look, even if you can show that there was a violation of the Constitution, I don't think that violation was clearly established. And so you can't even get to the next stage. And just to be clear, the next stage isn't like winning the lawsuit. The next stage isn't going to a jury. The next stage is doing something that we call discovery in litigation, which means we get to ask them questions, they get to ask us questions, we get to ask for documents that they have. It's the most critical part of a civil case. And if you can't get to that part of the civil case, imagine how hard it is to prove that someone did something wrong. So qualified immunity is just this barrier at every stage of the way. I could go into even more detail, but maybe I'll save it. But just in terms of the everyday person, I think it makes it harder to find a lawyer. And then even if you find a lawyer, it makes it harder to win your case. It can make the case stretch on for years and years. And at the end, maybe you end with a loss, even if you have shown that your rights have been violated.
Well, I think you're spot on because you mentioned barriers, and I was about to ask, what do you see as the biggest barriers to reform in this area?
Yeah. So if we take a step back, right, just again, a big picture perspective, there are lots of reasons that it's hard to sue officers, or whether I'll focus on policing and corrections, right, just for simplicity. There's lots of reasons it's hard to sue those officers, putting aside qualified immunity. There's lots of legal doctrine that puts up barriers, and they can be procedural barriers. Just what someone who's not a lawyer might call a technicality, but that's really important to the law. So there are those procedural barriers. And then there's what we would call substantive barriers, in the sense that the law already, even without qualified immunity, gives officers a lot of leeway. So let's take a case where an officer used force or used deadly force. The law already says even without qualified immunity, we're going to give the officer the benefit of the doubt in almost every way. You know, we're if the officer, even if, let's say, the officer thought the person was armed and the person wasn't armed, but the officer thought the person was armed, and there was something that the person did that made the officer reasonably think they were armed, well, that's going to give them a reason to use deadly force, even without qualified immunity. And so that's the big picture barriers, right? And then qualified immunity comes in even once you get past those big picture barriers, right? Even once you get past the procedural hurdles, or even once you can show that your rights actually were violated, then qualified immunity becomes another barrier to bring. So that's just the law, and then there's reality, right? The reality of finding a lawyer, the reality of convincing a judge to believe me, or to believe someone who's been incarcerated over the word of an officer, or convincing a jury to believe an incarcerated person or someone who's been caught up in the criminal legal system in some other way over the words of a police officer and a corrections officer. That's a reality that I think people have to deal with. So lots of barriers, but I'll stop there, and we can keep talking.
Yeah, that those specific barriers reminds me of the case with Tamir Rice, the 12-year-old boy who was shot for having the toy gun.
Yeah.
And I think I'm sure like the officer, he didn't get charged for shooting that kid because of probably those legal reasons, because the toy gun, and they refused to charge him. So
Yeah, I would say on the criminal side, right? We've been talking about the civil side. On the criminal side, lots of the same barriers are there. The additional barrier we should put in on the criminal side is that, you know, that when a prosecutor is deciding whether to charge a police officer, the prosecutors work with the police departments every day. So when they decide to charge a police officer, it creates some friction between the prosecutor's office and the police department that the prosecutor would rather avoid. And so it's really rare. It's really rare for prosecutors to even charge officers for use of force. And it's even rarer for those charges to be successful. And to me, I mean, that's a different problem than qualified immunity, but it's the same idea, which is that the law gives officers a lot of leeway.
Yeah, because I think they even took that case to like the U.S. Justice Department, and they declined it as well. But he was let go from that specific police force. But I know like officers, they can just reapply somewhere else if like they're not formally charged. Like it's not
Yeah,
like they
there's
can't
a
get
lot of
another job.
examples of that. Yeah, there's a lot of examples of officers rotating through from one department to another.
And I got I had a moment to like briefly go through your essay on qualified immunity's flawed foundation.
Mhm.
So I wanted to ask some questions about that.
Sure.
I wanted to ask, how do you respond to critics who argue that removing or limiting qualified immunity would expose government officials to excessive litigation, potentially hindering their ability to perform their duties?
Sure. I mean, that's an important question, and I'm glad you asked it. So I'll answer it on a couple of different levels. One is, again, just to get to the reality for a second. The reality is, no matter what, whether qualified immunity is in place or isn't in place, the individual officers almost never pay any of these damages from litigation. Almost always the state or the city, whoever is responsible for employing the officer, pays those damages. And that's usually a result of union contracts. Sometimes it's a result of state or local law. So qualified immunity, you know, the story people tell about qualified immunity, or at least the story the Supreme Court has told about qualified immunity, is that it's necessary to protect the individual officer from damages liability. The reality is that risk doesn't really exist. So that's one piece of it. The other piece of it is to go back to, the big picture I was talking about in terms of all the different barriers to actually obtaining justice in these cases. And one of the most important barriers is the law itself, aside from qualified immunity. So if I so most of the cases against police officers that involve use of force are brought under the Fourth Amendment. And so the question becomes, in those cases, was the officer reasonable in using force? And that's a question for whether that answers the question of whether they violated the Fourth Amendment. And the doctrine on that, the legal doctrine on that, is so protective of officers that even without qualified immunity, those protections about sort of giving the officer the benefit of the doubt would still be in place because just of the Fourth Amendment without even qualified immunity. So, I don't think actually, I think the question that I've sort of always been wondering about is, if we got rid of qualified immunity, how likely is it that we think it would reduce incidents of use of force and excessive use of force and deadly use of force? And I think that's a hard question to answer because we don't live in that world. It's like, how are we going to figure that out? We can't do an experiment, right? But I do think what would happen is police departments would become a lot more careful. I hope they would become more careful about who they hire and how they train them and how they discipline them. I think more careful than they are now. And we have to hope that that would have an impact on the way people behave and the way that they behave with respect to, the communities in which they engage every day.
Yeah, I also agree about the carefulness of picking police officers. And like, as a psychology student, I believe they should go through like mental exams and making sure everything's okay in the head and no prejudice or biases exist or any signs of like psychological disorders, because I feel like that plays a part as well. And getting back into the qualified immunity's flawed foundation, how do you envision a more just alternative to qualified immunity that balances the need for official accountability with protecting government employee from lawsuits?
Yeah. So again, I'll say I think one valuable way to, or at least that I think about it, that helps me think through it is, I think most problems of police use of force, corrections officers' use of force, I think most of them have systemic roots. Roots in terms of the department's relationship with the community, histories of racism and also class-based discrimination, and a culture essentially of impunity and a culture that sort of that glorifies kind of a hero approach to being an officer, which I think can sometimes encourage officers to use more force than necessary. So I think most of these problems come down to systemic solutions. And so the more we can put pressure on those systems, the municipalities, the cities, the counties that employ the officers, or the state departments that employ the corrections officers, let's say, the more we can put pressure on those systems to change how they operate, then I think the more successful we can be in having a just system. I'm not, like, I don't, nothing is perfect, and I think the law is only one answer, one part of the solution to these problems. I think a lot of the solutions to these problems lie in community organizing and activism, and I think the law can play one part in it. So in my world, the answer has to be systemic, and I think getting rid of qualified immunity would help us get towards that systemic response. I don't want to suggest it would automatically lead there, because as I do, the way the world works, it's a lot of imperfect people out there, and even if we think something's going to have an impact on a system, that doesn't guarantee that it's going to have an impact on it. But at the end of the day, if I have to choose between someone who's been harmed by unconstitutional conduct, right? What qualified immunity does is it leaves that person with no remedy at all, like just leaves them injured or dead, with no remedy at all, with no accountability at all. To me, that's the most unjust outcome. And so, if it's a choice between that and asking for systems and officials to be accountable, I'm always going to choose that systems and officials be held accountable, even if maybe, there are some circumstances where there's more burdens than we would want to place on those systems, because the alternative is leaving people who've been seriously harmed without any remedy at all.
Yeah, I did some research before, like on how like the police, like just the police in general, on how they came about. And I remember seeing that like at first, like police, they were like really community based. They were helping the community like with small problems, and they would settle it in court. But it has become a big systemic thing. But since it's been rooted in a system for so long, do you think that it can actually be like um refurbished in a way? Like, can we really rebuild that? It's been in that
Yeah.
system for so long.
Well, so this is the classic debate between abolition, I think, and reform. Uh, and again, it's a great question. Um, so I think there's some evidence that some departments have been able to change the way they relate to the community, in part because of litigation, but again, also because of community activism. And so, a good example, there's been some changes in New Orleans at the sort of local level in how police engage with the community. I don't want to suggest that again the problem is fixed, but there's been some improvement. So, abolitionists would say, yeah, there's no way to fix the system, and so we just sort of have to do away with it. I don't know if that's, I mean, as a theoretical matter, there's some, I think, value to that view. I don't think it's realistic. Um, and so, again, I want to live in the real world. Abolitionists would accuse me of like automatically sort of giving up by doing so, and I guess I hear that accusation. But I think one answer is reducing the footprint of the policing department, and so I think we have to acknowledge, like, it's really hard to be a police officer. People, the departments ask a lot of police officers, and to some degree, their police officers are asked to do too much. And one idea that people have teased with is like reducing that, um, those those obligations, and not expecting police officers to respond to mental health crises. Usually, when police officers respond to mental health crises, something bad happens. Um, and so finding ways to support other kinds of interventions. Now, the only way that happens is by reducing the footprint of policing, which means reducing the funding of policing. And so, in again, as a matter of reality, um, the political, there are very few politicians who are willing to take that stand. So I do think it's possible. Um, and I think I've seen some evidence that it's possible. I think, there are barriers to getting people to believe that it's feasible politically, or advisable from a policy perspective.
Yeah, I do agree with you. I feel like we have to be realistic. I feel like that's a bit too radical from the abolitionist like perspective about tearing the whole police department down. And I will say, I feel like they do give police a lot of, they require a lot from policemen. And I feel like with the over policing and like majorly like black communities, I feel like you give the police a lot of power and like they overexert that power. But
Yeah,
I
and when you're going to give someone power, then you have to have some way of overseeing that power, right? I mean, that's what we're missing.
and Yes, one more thing you said. Oh, yes. Police officers responding to people having mental health crisis, that does actually turn out bad. But I've been seeing more programs come about where they're actually having like trained mental health advocates like go to sites before police officers, and I feel like that's a great alternative and new way of approaching this. But it is 10:30, so we'll have a brief break. So before I ask you another question.
Great.
Introducing Next Generation Media Internship Program, designed for undergraduates, postgraduates, unemployed, dislocated workers, and WIOA participants. Our program offers remote virtual work experiences, qualifying as approved individualized career services. Learn while leading at your own pace, with part-time or full-time hours per week. Benefit from weekly debriefings and group supervision, along with our 15-minute masterclasses. Our projects include the Justice Beat Talk Show and the Just Us Youth Talk Show.
Last week's episode, you will not want to miss this week's episode where we'll be sitting down with Erica Nowakowski and talking about the mental health effects in juvenile justice system. If you have a loved one or a family member who has been impacted by mental health disability or the juvenile justice system, you will not want to.
All right, we're back. You so we're getting back into the Qualified Immunities Flawed Foundation essay, and you argued that qualified immunity undermines access to justice for individuals whose rights have been violated. Well, we've been speaking about everything, but I'll still ask: what changes should be made to protect the rights of individuals better while ensuring fair treatment for government officials?
Yeah. Well, so I think that we start with sort of a proposition that we were talking about before the break, which is we want a system that ensures accountability. I think if we are a society founded on the rule of law, then of all the things that we should enforce fully, it should be the Constitution. The Constitution is supposed to be the highest law of the land. So if we believe in enforcing the Constitution fully, then a doctrine like the doctrine of qualified immunity really interferes with enforcing the Constitution fully. And of course, of all the people who we should enforce it against, we should enforce it against the people who are responsible for administering our laws. That is, we should, I think, have the highest expectations of the people who are responsible for administering our laws. So that all speaks to me in the direction of doing away with qualified immunity. There is, of course, this concern that we, again, talked about before the break about, well, in what way will that burden officials? So we've talked about the financial burden. And as I said before, the financial burden is really kind of a fiction. There isn't much of a financial burden on individual officers. My colleague, Joanna Schwartz, who I've written some pieces with, also, she's a law professor at UCLA. She's done some research to show that how rare it is that police officers actually contribute to any settlements or damages awards. But I do want to say that even if we don't think there's a financial burden, still suing someone being a defendant, like that imposes a different burden. It's not just a financial burden. I think there's a psychological burden. I think no one wants to be a defendant in a lawsuit. It's not enjoyable, and so we should take that seriously. And I just think we probably want to take that seriously, but that doesn't mean doing something like qualified immunity. That just means having fair court processes, having fair procedural rules that allow people to defend themselves. And I think we've got all that in place already. So I'm not worried that if we do away with qualified immunity, that somehow what we'll have left is going to be unfair to officers. We're still going to have a lot of protection for officers in place, and they'll still be able to defend themselves, and their lawyers will be paid for by the city or the state that employs them. So I think we'll still have adequate protections for those officers, even if we did away with qualified immunity.
Okay, and we know you testified before Congress on qualified immunity. So could we hear a little about how you came into that and what that was about exactly?
Sure. In the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, there was some discussion in Congress, both from Republicans and Democrats, about amending some of the laws that the Supreme Court has interpreted as providing qualified immunity. And so there was some movement to do away with qualified immunity. Indeed, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act has a provision that eliminated qualified immunity. So both Republicans and Democrats were talking about this, and they were holding hearings about it. And I think one of the things that sort of broke down the bipartisan consensus around doing away with qualified immunity was this question that you and I have been talking about, which is, well, what's left in its place? And what the Republicans wanted to do was to make sure that individual officers would not themselves be held accountable, and that the counties or the cities or the states that employed them would have to pay for damages liability. And there were some Democrats who weren't comfortable with that, who felt like that undermined principles of accountability. So at the end of the day, I think that's really what made it more challenging for that legislation to be enacted. There were lots of other things about the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act that I think made it hard to reach bipartisan consensus. But on qualified immunity, I think the thing that really broke down the bipartisan momentum was figuring out what would be left if we did away with qualified immunity. So I testified basically to suggest to Congress both that there really wasn't a risk for individual officers of being left accountable for the financial burden if they did away with qualified immunity. And then I also wanted Congress to understand just how much qualified immunity sort of was invented by the Supreme Court more than anything. It really wasn't justified in law. So.
And how did I know you said you testified, did did the other side have the opposing side have opportunity to testify too?
Yeah, well, that was what was striking to me. There was someone who was there who was supposedly representing the unions, police unions. And that person, he was asked a question about whether or not he would support eliminating qualified immunity if, in its place, the cities or the counties that employed police officers would be held liable for the violations. And what was striking to me is that he refused to really answer that question. And I thought, well, if you're representing police officers, and I mean, why wouldn't you support sort of officially shifting responsibility from police officers to cities and counties? And honestly, I think the reason is because from the police union's perspective, one thing that qualified immunity really does accomplish is it really makes it hard for them to be held accountable in any way, financially or otherwise, right? So again, I don't think this is as much about finances as it is about police departments not wanting to be told what to do by courts in terms of the Constitution and applying the Constitution. So that was what was kind of interesting to me about the other side and their opposition to eliminating qualified immunity.
I find that very interesting. It kind of sounds like they're more concerned with protecting the police department rather than the police officer in the way. It's like they
Yeah, it was strange to me. I agree with you. That's what it felt like to me. And if you're a union, representing the officers, you're supposed to have the officers' interest in mind, not the departments themselves. But it gets to the bigger picture, which qualified immunity, like too many things, I think these days, have become sort of a cultural, political, very partisan. And so if you don't support qualified immunity, then you don't support police officers. And if you do support qualified immunity, then somehow it means you want to defund the police and abolish the criminal legal system. And of course, it's much more complex than that. But unfortunately, I think the police unions have done a good job of making it seem like anyone who doesn't support qualified immunity is against police.
What legal cases or historical evidence did you use to challenge the doctrine?
Sure. So the doctrine was introduced by the Supreme Court in 1967, and the case in which it was introduced was a case about freedom riders who had gone to the South to try and fight segregation. And while they were trying to fight segregation, they were beat up by some police officers. So this was in Mississippi. And they brought a lawsuit against those officers, and it made it all the way to the Supreme Court. And in that decision, the Supreme Court said police officers should be given immunity from liability if they acted in quote unquote good faith. And so that was the beginning of the qualified immunity doctrine, and it changed a little bit over time to become what it is today, where basically you can't hold an officer accountable, as I said at the top, unless you can show some prior decision from the Supreme Court or from some appeals court that makes it clear that what they did to you was unconstitutional. So that was the trajectory of the doctrine. And what I argued in my article was that the Supreme Court's decision in 1967 was a mistake in multiple ways. It was a mistake because it misunderstood what the Congress that enacted this federal legislation, what they were trying to do. The legislation has its roots in Reconstruction in the post-Civil War era. Legislation was meant to impose liability on state and local officials when they violated people's rights, and it was enacted way back in 1871. And if you go back to 1871, none of those legislators would have thought that they were somehow creating some immunity like the kind that the Supreme Court has imposed. So that was part of my argument. And then the other part of my argument was that when the law was passed in 1871, it had some very specific language in it that I argue in my article actually specifically says we don't want things like qualified immunity to prevent people from suing here. And that language, it was 16 words in the law, somehow never made it into the copy of the law that was then written down in 1874. So that's the copy that's been with us since then, but it was a mistake. That is, the person who was responsible for copying the 1871 Act into the book that was published in 1874 just didn't include these 16 words. No one knows why, and I argue in the article that if you actually look at those 16 words, they also suggest that Congress wouldn't have wanted qualified immunity. So it's really two pieces to my argument about how the Supreme Court got it wrong, along with a lot of work that's shown that that qualified immunity has all these negative consequences.
Yeah, that's actually that's new to me actually, that it was mistranslated from one document to the next, and you would think they would take that more seriously.
Yeah, it's a long story about again, going back to the law has these technical rules that I think, again, non-lawyers would say, well, that's crazy, and some lawyers would say that's crazy too. But we've got to put ourselves back in the 1870s, which is hard, and just think about how technology worked back then. I have no idea why this person, his title was, he was the reviser. He was the reviser of the federal statutes. And so again, I'm really worried about boring our listeners, but you know, we today we think like we could just go to a library, a law library, and find a federal law and say, okay, let me find it. It's in this book here, right? Well,
Right.
before 1870s, you couldn't do that. Before the 1870s, you had to go find the actual records from the Congress that passed that law in 1823, let's say, to find it. And so Congress decided in the 1870s, well, we should put it all in one place, right? We should put all of our laws in one place. And so this reviser, that was his job. His job was to take all of the laws that had been passed from the beginning of the country until 1873 and put them in one book. And he just made a lot of mistakes. And one of his mistakes was he didn't include these 16 words from one of the most important laws that's ever been enacted, I think, in the history of the United States, which is the 1871 Civil Rights Act. And no one knows why, but that's the story. And because of the technicalities of the law, that's the version we have. So
I can imagine the reviser's job at this time was very extensive. But
well, yeah, right. I mean, you think about it, he's got to go back through all the records of every Congress that sat since the founding of the country and copy down. Not it doesn't have a computer, obviously, right? It doesn't even have a
right.
typewriter. Just sort of you find it handwritten. Although I think actually it was by that point it was converted to type, not a typewriter, but it was actually converted to a book in typeset. So quite the challenge.
I can only imagine. And we know you're the director of the Cardozo Center for Rights and Justice, overseeing programs promoting fairness, equality, and access to justice. Can you tell us a little more about your work with the center?
Sure. Cardozo is a law school that has a long history of public service. It's where the Innocence Project was started, the original Innocence Project. It has a number of clinics that do work in the criminal legal space, in the immigration space, and lots of other spaces where we would be expecting lawyers to stand up for marginalized groups. And then it has different centers that focus on constitutional democracy and other important areas. And so the Center for Rights and Justice is sort of an umbrella for all of those groups. Some of what we do is we put on programs, some panels, conversations like what we're having today for students to learn more about what lawyers do in these worlds. We have conferences where people come, and then we also do things like when lawyers have important oral arguments in court, then we will organize a practice session for them and invite students to come, just so students can understand, well, this is what it takes to go from filing a case to arguing it in court, especially cases that are going to have a real impact on our justice system. And those are some of the things we do. And I just would say more broadly, Cardozo, with or without the center, is just always trying to do a lot in the community around public service, around issues of access to justice, around issues of immigrants' rights and the rights of people caught up in the criminal legal system. That's just been a big part of Cardozo since it was founded.
I love that you guys are training lawyers to be social justice advocates. That sounds great. And you mentioned the Innocence Project. What is that?
So the Innocence Project was started by Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld, and basically has had as its mission the goal of helping people who have valid claims of being actually innocent of charges to get their convictions thrown out. Now, there's lots of other innocence projects in the country, but the founding one was started at Cardozo, and it's had, I think, a tremendous impact on the criminal legal system. A lot of the work it's done has been in cases in which people are seeking exoneration through DNA evidence. So you can imagine that even today there are a lot of people who are incarcerated from a time when DNA was not as widely accessible or tested, or even really a conception that you could use it in a criminal case. And some of them have valid claims that they're innocent. And the DNA evidence sometimes can show that they actually are innocent of what they've been charged of. So I don't know how many people at this point have been exonerated by all the innocence projects throughout the country, but it's many hundreds, if not more. It's really important work.
Yeah, that does sound like really important work. And getting into our closing questions, I wanted to ask, as someone with experience in both academia and litigation, how do you see the role of legal education evolving to better equip future lawyers for addressing contemporary social issues?
Yeah, so that's something I think about a lot. Another great question. I see my role as a professor. Of course, my first job is to help students learn how to be good lawyers and ethical lawyers. And that doesn't mean every student I have is going to go on and do the things that I did as a lawyer, because I have certain values and I don't expect my students to share those values. And I don't think it's my job actually to get them to share my values. I want to think about what their values are and how to use the law in service of those values. Now, I do think the one thing that I want all of my students to value is equality. I think that it's kind of a fundamental principle, if you want to be a lawyer, that you be committed to equality under the law, and that people be treated fairly. So my job as a professor is to teach them that, to teach them the law, and to teach them how to use the law, as I say, ethically and as good lawyers, and above all, I think, with a commitment to equality. I also think it's my job to model what it means to be a professional. And at least I try to carry myself as a professional in a way that I hope my students can learn from and will appreciate, even if, again, they're not going to make the same choices that I'm going to make, but I want them to think about those choices. I think everything we do as a lawyer, we're making choices about how we use our skills. So that's how I think about myself as a teacher. And as an academic, I usually write about issues that I care about. The issues that I care about tend to be issues about access to justice. They tend to be issues about equality. They tend to be issues about making sure people are able to be held accountable, and also people receive some measure of justice in our system. But I also sometimes write about things that just interest me, that maybe they have nothing to do with some of those fundamental principles that I learned as a kid. So I'll do both, but I do think my scholarship is geared towards thinking about how the law affects people, and trying to make the law fairer. And then as a lawyer, right? I'll say this because it's so true. The privilege of being able to help someone solve a problem, big or small, is just that's what it means to be a lawyer. And I'm so grateful that I've been able to have a career where I've been able to do that for some people. As a lawyer, I'm always thinking about whether or not, what's the best way I can use whatever talents I have to try and make the legal system more just, and maybe the world more just. I tell my students this because I believe it. I think lawyers have to be really humble. I don't think that law is the solution to everything. And again, we talked about this a little bit as well. I think that most social problems are not solved in the courtroom, that if law is playing a role, it's got to be in community, with people who are on the streets, with people who are speaking up for marginalized folks in other ways. Maybe that's political advocacy, maybe that's community advocacy. So I think lawyers sometimes think that we have a bigger role than we do, but we have a role. And so it's really important that I think about whether I'm using my skills to try and make the world slightly better.
Well, I think you have incredible insights, and I know your students are learning a lot from you because I've learned a lot from you in this past hour, and I,
Well, I
I think
appreciate that, but I hope you're right.
I know they are. I'm sure. I'm certain. Um, what can students, community leaders, and social justice advocates do to educate our communities and raise awareness about qualified immunity?
Wow. I think there are some really concrete things that can be done. Now, our listeners are all over the country, right? And maybe even outside of the US, who knows? Um, One thing that I've been talking to a lot of people about is the Supreme Court's not going to change qualified immunity. And even if Congress isn't going to change qualified immunity, states and local governments, they can do things. So there are 2 states that have passed laws in the last few years. So Colorado and New Mexico have passed laws in the last few years, creating a way for people to sue officers without there being qualified immunity. And other states can do that. I'm working with a lot of people in New York. We've been trying to get the New York legislature and the governor to sign on to a bill. It's been in session many years in a row, and every year we get a little more support that would create a way for people to sue officers without qualified immunity. So there's very concrete things that people can do to try and work with state and local legislators to find ways to get accountability in state and local courts. So that's one way. I think we have seen, if anyone has been to any protests about police force, excessive use of deadly force, maybe you've seen signs that say end qualified immunity. And I'll tell you, 10 years ago, I would have never imagined I would be in a world in which I would show up at a protest and see someone holding a sign that says end qualified immunity. But I see it today. And I think people have become more conscious. And of course, shows like this hopefully will help, more conscious about the costs of qualified immunity and what it does to our justice system. So I think having those discussions, getting people to think about it. And then probably the last piece of it is really when you hear someone talking about, well, if you do away with qualified immunity, it means police officers are going to lose their homes because they're going to get sued. It's just really important to call that out as just a myth, just a total fiction. It is not based in reality. And unfortunately, I think too many elected officials just repeat that over and over again, and it's fundamentally untrue. So it's about educating your communities, it's about educating your legislators, it's about making sure people understand you care about what happens in the civil justice system, because it has an effect on all of us.
I definitely agree with you. I feel like they try to get the citizens to sympathize with police officers. And now that we know that it's fiction, through education, we can learn more and educate the communities. Um, with us in our last minute or so, are you currently working on anything or doing any exciting, impactful projects that you're involved in that you want to share?
Well, I always hope so. I mean, I've got some scholarship out that is kind of interesting, but I won't talk about that. I'm working on some cases involving the treatment of incarcerated people at Rikers Island, and mostly about the use of restrictive conditions of confinement on people at Rikers Island, conditions that are like solitary confinement, but not exactly solitary confinement. And I think, that to me, the importance of solitary confinement and the way we treat people in prisons and jails, so that's been something I've been worried about, I think, since I started my work as a lawyer more than 20 years ago. So to me, that's going to continue to be an area of interest that I hope to continue working on, and also hopefully marginally improving the experience of people who are incarcerated, because solitary is kind of the tip of the iceberg in terms of how dehumanizing it is for people who experience it. But I think it's just incredibly important to keep reminding people that, to have a just criminal legal system, we've got to treat the people who are caught up in it like human beings, and solitary doesn't do that.
And are there any platforms that the people can find you on if they want to connect with you?
Well, it's easy to find me just by searching my name. You can just email me. I'm occasionally on X, but given who is in charge of X, honestly, I try to keep keep myself at a minimum there. But otherwise, it is incredibly easy to find me. Just Google my name and Cardozo, and send me an email.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor Reinart, for coming on and speaking with us. We appreciate all of your information. I feel so filled with education. I learned so much today, and I've enjoyed speaking with you. And yeah.
Well, thanks for your great questions, and it's been great to speak with you too.
Thank you for listening to the Justice Beat. If you like what you heard and found the information useful, then support the Justice Beat radio show by spreading the word and telling a friend.
Last week's episode, you will not want to miss this week's episode, where we'll be sitting down with Erica Nowakowski and talking about the mental health effects in juvenile justice system. If you have a loved one or a family member who has been impacted by mental health disability or the juvenile justice system, you will not want to miss this week's episode.